Joining me now from Hamilton in Ontario, Canada is Jason Allen, where he hosts a radio show as the environmental urbanist. China's taken steps in recent years to try to do something about the flooding. In 2014, the country started working on a pilot sponge city program, 16 of them in 2015, 14 in 2016. Can you explain to us what this concept is? Is it likely to take off? Can it make much of a difference?
So Sponge City is this idea of taking a whole bunch of other types of flood mitigation interventions that have been in place around the world for a long time now. So things like green roofs and permeable paving and water storage tanks and things like that. But whereas elsewhere in the world, those things have been done kind of piecemeal or on a small sort of property by property basis, Sponge Cities applies all of these strategies at once to an entire municipality. So it's a pretty big undertaking.
And when we talk about these sponge cities, I mean, we saw this in Germany getting swamped as well. Is this, with climate change, is this something we're going to be looking at all around the world? I mean, where we have to kind of adapt in this sense?
All over the world this is coming. So what we know about the sort of climate change induced weather is that it takes what's already been in place for the last 100 years or so and makes it more extreme. So the places that were wet before are getting much more rainfall, and places that were dry, like for instance Western United States, are getting much more dry and staying that way.
You're talking about climate change. It's interesting. The Washington Post did an extensive story on the flooding in Zhengzhou. Meteorologist Matthew Capucci pointing out that the Chinese national record in Zhengzhou may be the most prolific short-term rain event to ever affect a major international city. So much rain in just a short period of time. So can you talk to us about weather monitoring technology? Can that make a difference in the future? What are we seeing there? Because that was also a complaint in Germany that, boy, we got swamped. We really didn't have enough warning.
Well, part of the problem with weather monitoring technology is that when climate change hits and things like the jet stream get all wobbly and we see weather patterns either dipping where they don't normally go or staying where they shouldn't normally stay, these things get very unpredictable. And so there's a limit to how much we can predict really climate change and weather that's kind of gotten very angry with us. And so, like, for instance, the heat dome that happened in the Western U.S., that wasn't predicted to happen ever. It's not something scientists ever saw coming, and now we know that it's a regular feature of what's going to be occurring in the future.
Jason, I was listening to an expert on climate change the other day on the radio, and he said we're focusing right now on reducing CO2, talking about closing coal-fired power plants, but the reality is we should be thinking about pivoting to deal with these effects of climate change because they're happening right now. You just talked about it. We're seeing these weather extremes, but that's also colliding with realities. I was reading today, it's estimated in 2035, 70% of China's population will live likely in urban areas. What more do you think can be done to kind of prepare for these weather events, especially with the reality that you're seeing a lot of people moving into these urban areas?
I think a lot of people are now saying that we need to pivot away from mitigation, which is preventing climate change, and into adaptation, but it's really a both-and situation. So we need to be preparing for sea level rise, for increased flooding, for increased drought, for increased problems around crop failure. At the same time, we're doing everything we can to reduce our CO2 and even our methane emissions so that we can prevent runaway climate change and the worst from really happening.
Jason, it's interesting. We hear about these new technologies, 5G, AI. Do you think the new technologies can help us in these struggles?
I'm a bit of a Luddite on that whole issue. I find that the more advanced the technology, the more brittle it is in the face of climate disasters. Like, for instance, when severe weather hits, the first thing that goes out is the power. The second thing that goes out is the telecom. So I know in Germany, for instance, during the floods, there were thousands of people who couldn't even get a signal on their cell phones to call for help. So what I love about the Sponge City initiative is that a lot of it is landscaping and it's hard infrastructure that functions whether or not the computer or the power is running at all, and it helps to prevent the flooding on a really grand scale that way.
Yeah, it's a really good point because we've had so much reporting on internet being down, phone service being down. Real good points. Jason, great talking to you. Thanks so much for your insights.
Thanks for having me.